Hello and welcome back to our series on Ashby's seminal work and introduction to cybernetics. So today we're going to be jumping into chapter 7, variety. Variety is a term you may ordinarily associate with the spice of life, but in the world of cybernetics, it takes on a whole new meaning. So in this context, variety refers to the multitude of possible states that a system can adopt. So today we're going to be exploring this concept like a 1,000-foot view. So we're going to be delving into some of the nuances for information theory and communications, the role of constraints, and the relationship between variety and predictability. So look at this cool thing. It's a graph. Welcome to my stuff. That's supposed to be a wand. I made that in latex. You're welcome. It's horrible, but I think it's cool. See, Economancer. It's a terrible joke. All right, so we're going to start with like mechanic thinking. And so what do I mean by this? So consider a mechanic tinkering with an engine. So he doesn't know exactly what might be wrong with it. The fundamental uncertainty, Ashby argues, must be quantified to truly understand regulation and control. Here he introduces the concept of variety. So that's a set of possibilities that encompass everything the system might do. To comprehend this, we'll delve deeper into information and communications theory. So in Ashby's view, our mechanic doesn't just tinker aimlessly. He systematically reduces the possible causes of the problem, cutting down the variety of potential engine issues. Variety in this context describes the different states a system can adopt, and it's important in regulation and control, which is central to cybernetics. So another thing to think about with this mechanic thinking, science thrives on repetition. The sun rises and sets every day. An apple falls to the ground when dropped. These constraints, or these constants, allow us to predict and understand our world. Similarly, Ashby brings up 4 sets of possibilities to illustrate how scientific principles apply to cybernetics. Science is all about identifying patterns, reducing uncertainty, just like our own mechanic is going to narrow down the possible causes of an engine problem. Scientists try to whittle down variety of possible explanations for a phenomenon to a manageable set. For example, Newton's law of motion greatly reduced the possible explanations for why an apple falls from a tree. But how do we talk about a set versus an individual, which is an extremely important topic right now if you're in like the manosphere or whatever that is on YouTube? This is important. Ashby uses an engaging example of 20 million women having 30 million children. On average, each woman has 1.5 children. But it's essential to remember that this average is about the set, not the individual. We can't meaningfully say that a particular woman has 1.5 children, which when he goes into this in this book, I like cracked up laughing the way he explains it. Distinguishing between a set and an individual can be tricky. Ashby's examples help us understand this distinction. Each woman in the set can't physically have 1.5 children. However, when we look at the set as a whole, we can average out the number of children they have. This perspective gives us valuable insights, but this can also lead to misconceptions if not handled carefully. Similar conclusions arise when we talk about probabilities. It's easy to fall into the trap of applying probabilities to individuals instead of sets where they rightly belong. For example, when we say that a person has a 50% probability of being married, it's a statement about the population set, not the individual. Misapplying these can lead to paradoxes. Probability, like average, is a measure that makes sense when applied to a set, not an individual. All right, make that clear, to a set, not an individual. When we say there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, we're not saying it will rain half the day. We're saying that given the current weather conditions, about half the time, it would rain the next day. Misunderstandings like this can lead to confusion and erroneous conclusions. And this is one of those big issues in statistics and probability and people not understanding what's going on. And why do I have the input black box output from the last one? Because again, this is a part of this mechanized machine thinking, right? Like going back to the mechanic. All right. So Drawing from the pioneering work of Shannon and Weaver, I prefer Shannon, Ashby relates communications to the existence of a set of possibilities. A single unchanging message means no communication, for there are no other possibilities. Therefore, the act of communicating, we'll get into that, inherently involves variety. Communication, like variety, is about possibilities. If there's only one possible message, there's no need for a communication. The message is a foregone conclusion. But when there are multiple messages, communication becomes crucial to convey which possibility is realized. So Hayek and Thomas Sowell also used this kind of discussion of communications, information, sets of possibilities, and stuff like that when they're discussing markets, because they say that it's not just the static present set of institutions or buyers and sellers in the market that is a market. Market also encompasses future sets. So this is a set. So this is variety, as defined by Ashby, is the number of distinct elements within a set. But keep in mind that this is not an intrinsic property to the set or of the set. It's based on how an observer distinguishes the elements. Variety is contextual and observer dependent. Variety depends on the observer's perspective. If you look at a set of objects and you can't tell them apart, then from your perspective, the variety is minimal. However, someone else might be able to distinguish the objects, and for them, the variety much higher. Variety is subjective and depends on who is observing. Again, this is where we're moving. I haven't gone into it, but this is a movement that Ashby's bringing up here that I've said multiple times. We're moving from first order cybernetics into second order cybernetics, which is observing the observer, right? Because we understand that there are things that are contextual and observer dependent, then we need to observe the observer. This is the basis for second order cybernetics, and this is why Luhmann and a lot of cyberneticians are radical constructivists. Woo, here's math. Yay. That's a logarithm. That's entropy. That's cool. We'll get into that when we go into the actual triple helix model. Once we finish this, probably going to go into the triple helix model, then we'll go into Introduction to Cybernetics or Systems Theory by Luhmann. It's up in the air. We'll figure it out. So when variety is measured in logarithm form, it's measured in bits, binary digits. This conversion gives us a more mathematical framework to work with. For example, the variety of two sexes, two distinct elements, is 1 bit. When variety is measured logarithmically, it becomes a bit more abstract, but also more manageable. For instance, a set with 2 elements has a variety of 1 bit, as it takes one binary decision to distinguish between 2 elements. This binary system simplifies the quantification of variety. So, constraints. A constraint is a relation between 2 sets that reduces the variety from one condition to another. A traffic light, for instance, constrains the variety of actions that drivers can take at an intersection. Constraints are fascinating because they both limit and enable possibilities, which people may not understand that part, but a traffic light restricts the actions of a driver, but it also enables a safer and more orderly flow of traffic. Constraints reduce variety, but also shape it in ways that can be more productive and beneficial. Well, we're gonna pop back because we're gonna be going through a little bit. So constraints can be slight or severe with different outcomes. A minor constraint might gently nudge a system in a certain direction, while a severe constraint might force it onto a single path. Different constraints have different effects. A light constraint might gently guide this toward that particular outcome, and we'll think of this like nudges in behavioral economics, which is why I brought it up earlier. So like a nudge is only going to try to tend your psychic system toward a particular outcome. In contrast, the severe constraint that will rigidly dictate the psychic system's behavior would be something like a law. So the degree of constraint affects how much variety remains and how much it can be expressed. So if we think about vectors in a set with various components, each component has its own variety. but the total variety of the set of vectors is different, and crucially, it cannot exceed the sum of the varieties of the components. The total variety in a system depends on its individual components. If each component operates independently, then the total variety is the sum of each component's variety. However, if the components interact or are dependent upon each other, then the total variety can be less than the sum of the parts. And I know that may sound crazy, but you can think about a chair is in 3 dimensions has 6 degrees of freedom, and we'll get to that. But that shows you the amount of movement and how much the components matter when we think of the system itself, because the components of a chair can be broken down into numerous parts, and each one of those parts has its own individual variety. So, degrees of freedom. So, in a set of vectors, that tells us how many components with independence would give the same variety. If all combinations are possible, the degrees of freedom equal the number of components. But if only one combination is possible, then degrees of freedom are 0. Degrees of freedom, a related concept, reflect how many independent components there are in the system. So if all the components are independent, then the degrees of freedom is equal to the number of components. But if the components are interdependent or constrained, then the degrees of freedom is less. That's vital here. So constraints are of vital importance in cybernetics. When a constraint exists, we can usually lever it to our advantage. Shannon's work, for instance, estimates the variety, assuming full independence, shows the presence of redundancies or constraints and how they enable efficient channel use. Constraints are essential in many fields, like information theory, where they allow us to manage and control variety. The presence of constraints, such as redundancy in the message we discussed earlier, allows us to compress data and communicate it more efficiently. Another way to think about constraints is a budget constraint. You have a set of possibilities of things that you can buy, but you can only buy in so much as the amount of money you have. So your budget constrains the amount of choices that you have. There's a big argument in economics that happened after Becker, who said, hey, we should just stop using utility anyway. We should just maximize based on your budget constraint and figure it out from there. And that's really the point here, is that constraints are fundamental in our reality. And I really like this. You get to see, like, here is the budget constraint for Y and X, or actually, what is this? This is a box for international trade or trade between two individuals. Anyway, for this, it just shows that we have this distance between X and Y. They're constrained along these lines, and then these are all the possible states that could happen within the system, but we can't because it's constrained to the red line. All right, I think this was the coolest part of the whole chapter. So each law of nature is a constraint. The law of gravity, for example, constrains objects to fall toward the center of the earth. In other words, it limits the variety of motion an object can have. Every natural law acts as a constraint. For example, gravity, as we discussed earlier, restricts the motion of objects, constraining them to fall towards the earth. These constraints, or laws of nature, reduce the variety of possible movements. All natural laws are constraints. Full stop. This includes social natural laws, right? So the law of supply and demand, those are constraints. You have demand, that constrains. You have supply, that constrains. You have exchange of information within the total, like, universal system, that is constrained. A law of nature is a constraint. Man is constrained because the law of nature is constrained. And, you know, back to theology very quickly, this is the mercy that God gives us by reducing our time on earth and stuff like this, and moving us closer so that we can learn to understand our need for repentance. But anyway, so a physical object can be a constraint as well. A chair, being a collection of parts, as we talked about, has 6 degrees of freedom for movement. So just 6. However, if the parts were unconnected, each would have, its own 6 degrees of freedom. And if you're wondering why it has 6 degrees of freedom, it's because it's in 3-dimensional space. So it has a far greater variety if you thought about each individual part. But because they're all together, there's less variety. So physical objects too impose constraints. So this chair that I'm sitting in, because it's made of many parts, it has a limited range of movement dictated by those connections between its parts. If we were to able to disassemble it, and then each one of those compartments would have their own degree of freedom, as we discussed earlier, that would increase total variety. But the physical object itself reduces the freedom, or the degrees of freedom that we have, and it also reduces our ability to move in it. Even though it has wheels, it can't go as fast as a car, so it constrains how fast we can go, or how high we can go, etc. That is a physical object as a constraint. And if you see this picture, you're like, this is weird. Why is this doing this? You said there's 6 degrees of freedom, and I'm looking at this, and this says 8. Why are you doing this? Well, first of all, you're rude for thinking that. So these, like the X in the center, that's cool. That encompasses all of it, and then you have up and down. So you only need 4 directions and up and down. Anyway, I know, it's crazy. So we're going to be jumping through this. Actually, yeah, we'll leave it on this one. So predictability implies constraints, right? So if we can predict the weather accurately, it's because the atmospheric conditions impose constraints on the possible outcomes. The more constraints there are, the more accurately we can predict the future. Learning is only possible when the environment shows constraint. If you have infinity, you cannot learn infinity. Learning is a process of reducing variety itself. So as you learn a new route, you're reducing the variety possible of paths to your destination by recognizing the constraints like turns and landmarks, right? But learning only exists when the environment has or shows constraint. You cannot learn infinite, right? I think Daniel Hoffman has a really good amount of work on this. Like, suppose a person had like downloaded the entire universe into their mind, they would literally explode, right? Because there's just too much information, even for the brain, which is like the greatest processing power thing in the world. Our intellect is beyond anything that we can imagine in the universe itself, but it can't take in an infinity, right? And this is also a part of how we can know the energies of God, but we cannot know the essence. And there's a lot of arguments here. The Thomistic tradition would have it that you can't know the essence in infinite because the infinite of the essence is more of an infinite than the infinite amount of vision given by God to man. And then for the Orthodox tradition, we're going to say, like, we can't see the essence of God. It is too much, etc. But we can infinitely dive into or infinitely learn the energies, but the energies themselves are from an infinite source, or are an infinite source. Depends on your reading of that, I guess. But we can't take in all of that. That is beyond the intellect. So here's one we can jump into. So over time, variety decreases. This decrease is evident when you consider a box filled with different objects. As you remove objects from the box, there are fewer objects remaining, thus reducing variety of items in the box, right? We can kind of put this on everything. This is kind of a basic in reality. This is also the argument of entropy, right? That there's going to be heat death in the universe. Was it second law of thermodynamics? That's something we'll get into. Is, the second law of thermodynamics, Ashby's law of requisite variety, and a few other laws. They're all connected on, well, obviously they're all connected by constraints, but they're all connected in a way of showing this change of chaos entropy, etc., into order, and then vice versa. They're all associated with that. And probably somewhere down the line on the episode of the requisite variety on the law, I will go over that because I think it's really cool and really important. All right. This is one of those important things that I think gets missed in our modern day. So in the final part of the chapter, Ashby describes how a uniform change at the inputs of a set of transducers can decrease the set's variety. This tendency towards uniformity or standardization is a principle that permeates many aspects of our world. The principle can be observed in many parts of the world, from the standardization of manufacturing processes to the regularization of language. This is the works on isomorphism. I'm pretty sure you've heard me use that term in the triple helix, talking about how government regulations cause coercive isomorphism, and then, you know, business best practices have mimetic isomorphism, but all systems tend to isomorphism. That's also the reason why all systems collapse in on themselves and have a new system take its place. This is Creative Destruction by Joseph Schumpeter. This is extremely important if you ever want to understand evolutionary or dynamic theory of systems, especially in economics. And I think that's a really cool graph. You're welcome. So this concludes the exploration of Chapter 7, Variety. As we've seen, variety is an integral part of cybernetics, and we're going to be cracking open with it a whole lot more. But this is going to be informing our understanding of systems, communications, and control. We've discussed how constraints can shape variety and how predictability, in turn, implies the presence of constraints. Most importantly, we've learned that variety isn't a static or intrinsic property of a system, but rather it's an observant-dependent context. I hope this discussion has provided you with valuable insights and will help you see like a new world through this lens of cybernetics. Remember, these principles that we're learning today and tomorrow, etc., they don't just apply to mechanical or computational systems. They also apply to social systems, biological systems, even the systems of our everyday lives. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to exploring this more. Please like, share, subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or if you're looking into anything in cybernetics and you'd like to see it cracked open a little bit more, I would love to do that. And I am the Economancer. Have a good one.